Good morning, students. So today we're going to have our lecture on the National School Lunch Programs and the physical education that is practiced in school campuses. And today's lecture is rather short, but it actually focuses mostly on the National School Lunch Program. And then for the PE part, I wanted to do a little creative project which is going to draw upon the readings from this week's and this module that are posted on D2L. And we're going to talk about that when we reach that point in our lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about the National School Lunch Program, the NSLP, the short abbreviated form, and I'm probably going to refer to that throughout the lecture. It's just a lot more easier to say that rather than the full term, the National School Lunch Program. So the NSLP was actually started in 1946. And it was started in response to the congressional concerns about, a great number of young men who could not qualify for the World War II draft. And why was that? It was because of the poor nutritional health that was evidently seen throughout all of the draftees at that point in time. In fact, 1/3 of those who were sent drafts to were rejected for military services because of the nutritional deficiencies. So thus, in 1946, we started the NSLP, and the main agenda and the main objective was to safeguard the health and the well-being of the nation's children. Now, the NSLP has been in practice for more than about 75 years, but the problem is that although it was initiated and was put into place with a good intention, we have a very evident need to revamp the program. And why is that? Because more than 1/3 of the children that are also using NSLP services are obese. School meals can have a large impact on children's diet, and oftentimes when we talk about childhood obesity, the school meals, school lunches, breakfasts, they often get overlooked. However, they are the main source of nutrition, especially for those that are belonging to the low-income youth, and are also most likely to be the recipients of those school meals. And then in addition, we have both obesity and hunger that is coexisting in some of those families from the low socioeconomic status. And that presents an additional challenge for nutrition programs within schools to balance this need to prevent hunger as well as obesity. So if you remember from our previous lecture, we talked about the concept of double burden. This is sort of an extension of that concept where, there is hunger within a family, and then there's also obesity. And the reason is whenever food choices are made or whenever there's an access to food is often the unhealthier food, which adds up the empty calories. It's energy dense food. That is of little to no nutritional value, and thus it impacts the body in a negative way. However, the child still doesn't get to eat as often as they need to, and thus we're looking at both of those situations perhaps happening. Now, the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program have to meet these federally defined nutrition standards. And if you remember from the lecture in previous module, we talked about the USDA's nutrition guidelines. And it's important for school administrations to comply by those policies in order to receive federal subsidies. Now, what you may ask, well, what exactly are those federal subsidies? Those are the cash reimbursements and the commodity foods that every school administration receives if they meet the criteria that has been set by the federal government for the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. And it's not as simple as one may think. Actually, there's a whole process of inventory, data collection, data analysis, sending in reports, and then perhaps finding out if the school passed those requirements and will continue to receive the reimbursements and the commodity foods. And therefore, there's a very fine line from which the schools can experiment with the lunch menus, and that often gets translated into, the same menus being repeated over and over and over, since they're really trying to meet that standard. However, like I said earlier, the school lunch program's initial policies were put in place about 75 years ago, so therefore we have a definitive need to revamp the program. All right, so moving on, several studies have been done, and they have collected data on NSLP and the School Breakfast Program, also known as SBP, on how they can really be instrumental in improving a child's diet, affecting specifically children from low-income bracket the most. And they have some really good data that backs up why these federal programs need to be strong, need to be highly nutritious, and need all kinds of food groups in the food pyramid to make sure that if this is the only meal that a child is receiving throughout the day, it is of the nutritious kind. Let's look at the participation rate in the National School Lunch Program. We have about 30 million youth, 30 million students each year that participate in the National School Lunch Program. Now remember, just because it's a National School Lunch Program does not mean it is a reduced price. There are further categories within that we're going to look at. So from that number of 30 million youth, we have about 2/3, which makes up about 59%. So let's say about 60% of students who are participating in the National School Lunch Program are receiving a free or reduced price meal. Looking at the school breakfast program, we have a student participation of about 10 million students each year. And from that, 81% actually receives free or reduced price meal. That really tells you that we have a high number, a high percentage of participation in the NSLP and the SBP that are receiving free and reduced price meals. So that's when we mentioned this point right here, that more than 1/3 of the children that are on NSLP are obese, and that this particular bracket mostly impacts children and students who belong to the low socioeconomic status. It really holds true, and you're able to see the kind of level and the kind of impact it has on those students, especially when we have such a high majority that are receiving a free or reduced price meal, and perhaps maybe using these services as their only meals in the day. The majority of the U.S. school meals meet standards for proteins, for vitamin A, C, calcium, and iron. However, only 1/3 of the public schools meet the USDA standards for total fats. In fact, most of them exceed that standard, and there's a huge issue with that. I'm going to give you a personal example. So during my time in high school, we used to get easily access to, French fries and ice cream cones and things like that. However, fast forward several years, now the French fries are no longer fried, they're baked in fact. There are no longer ice cream cones and things like that are available in school lunch lines. I mean, we're still looking at a lot of unhealthier foods, but stuff that was specifically offered through the National School Lunch Program is no longer there, and there is a reason for that, is because they are exceeding the total fat intake, in fact, in most of the schools. Again, this ties in with our concept that was mentioned in childhood obesity lecture, the cost of double burden, which was a challenge for school nutrition programs wanting to balance the need to prevent hunger as well as obesity, and it was occurring because you were consuming energy-dense, empty calories. So the National School Lunch Program calorie breakdown per meal for each age group, I thought it was really important for us to see that how did the calories or the number of calories per meal differed for each school campus. Starting from elementary school, the lunches actually need about 664 calories per meal. And we see about 79, let's say roughly 80% of elementary schools that meet the standard. There is a 20% that exceed in large amounts in terms of the calories that are needed per meal. So even at an elementary level, we see about 20% of the schools that are not necessarily strictly abiding by the federal guidelines, and in fact exceeding in that. Not in a good way. Then we're looking at secondary school lunches that need about 825 calories per meal. Only 1/2 of the high schools offered lunches that were adequate in those calories, and the other half again exceeded in the number of calories that they were offering per meal. And that is detrimental, because we also see that this is the age group that gets impacted with childhood obesity the most. The Institute of Medicine, when they conducted that study in 2010 that was mentioned in the Weight of the Nation Children in Crisis documentary, initially the study started in 2007, and then the results were released in 2010. The study basically revised the nutrition recommendation and the guidelines of the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. Guess when was the last revision for the nutritional recommendations for these two programs? It was in 1990s. It was actually more than 20 years ago. In addition to that, I wanted to also talk about why do we really need physical education or PE in schools. Now, as you can see, these are the 3 slides that we have in this lecture that talked about the National School Lunch Program, and that's all we're going to discuss. we have now completed our content on NSLP and SBP, the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. Now I want to go ahead and move towards physical education in schools. The way I want to cover this is I want to make it a little bit hands-on and interactive activity. So in my face-to-face lecture, I kind of make it a class activity, and sometimes I dedicate about 15 to 20 minutes of the class time, even 30 minutes, a half a class period, to doing this activity. And it's really fruitful because it allows you to see physical education, and it's important in a different aspect. Now, based on the reading assignment that has been posted in this module, and also in collaboration with the supplemental material from last module, I want you to design like a small PE course for your local elementary school. Make your pick. It could be your own high school. It could be high school here from Nacogdoches community, Nacogdoches High School, whatever you choose. You could even pick another campus, a middle school or an elementary school. What I'm interested in seeing is that what kind of physical activities would you like to use? If you were given a 30 to 40 minute session, and if, let's say if we're speaking hypothetically, all the funding that was required for you to have that time allotment was, processed and it came through, and now you have a PE course of, let's say, 40 minutes with high schoolers or middle schoolers or elementary students. How would you utilize that, and what kind of physical activities would be placed into that time frame that would help students not just, meet their level of cardio for that day, but, also additionally meet goals of eradicating childhood obesity. So I'm kind of looking in that direction. Furthermore, how would you defend the PE course to your local school board? If you notice, or if you remember from The Weight of the Nation, Children in Crisis, there was a very specific part of documentary where the comptroller of Texas had personally funded a PE course in several middle schools. The reason was the PE education courses were being taken away from school's curriculum because we needed more additional time for academic courses. And because of that, we saw how it negatively impacted students' health in several ways. Teachers talked about how lack of nutritious food and lack of physical activity courses were responsible for lack of focus among students, how they were more tired, how they were not more engaged in classroom. So what would be your reason to defend the PE course to your local school board so that the funding would continue? And I want you to draw upon the benefits of physical activity to kind of make a convincing case for the continuity of the PE class. You are welcome to use any additional resources that you may find from research databases and online. And I want you to address the possible obstacles that you might be facing in the process of, really being the advocate for the PE course in the local school board. Go ahead and type up your responses and email it to me, and I would be very interested to see how do you respond to that. This is how I want to teach you physical education section in this particular lecture. So even though the participation is not for a grade, you have to do it in order to understand this concept for this module, and also in order to be able to respond to questions on this topic in exam 2. So in a way, even though it's not for a grade, it is very important for you to participate. Let's look at what's happening next module. So in our next lecture, we're going to be talking about eating disorders. We have a class viewing of documentary Thin. We'll continue on to keep up with the supplemental reading assignments. And most importantly, I want you to begin working now, if you have not already, on the final paper of your health planning document. You should be seeing a grade that has gone down for your group. There is no reason for you to delay this. There is no reason for you to postpone or procrastinate. This is a summer course. It works really fast, and the deadline for the final paper is approaching very fast as well. So get to work on that very quickly. If you have any questions, feel free to email me through my SFA or through D2L. I prefer my SFA email address. All right, talk to you later.